So for today, I still want to continue talking about the Superboy verse from 1988 to 1992. And this episode is the first time the series featured a super-powered villain from the comic books. Well, I guess magic-powered. And that, of course, would be Mr. Mxyzptlk. Mxyzptlk, however the hell that's pronounced. Either way, it's a pretty interesting episode, so we'll do all the usual things that we do here, and then we'll kind of get into it. So, alright, let's go!
So on this one incredibly windy day, like out in the field, Professor Royer and his crew are trying to remove a totem pole from its perch, but the thing won't budge, right? Like, not even with heavy equipment. But Superboy is called in to help out, but to Lana and TJ's astonishment, man, he can't budge this thing either. Like, what the heck, right? But after working at it for a while, Superboy finally gets this thing moving, and as soon as it is out of the ground, blip, the totem pole disappears, and some strange looking dude just appears out of thin air. Mxyzptlk is his name, and he is a silly magic man. And he's totally focused on Superboy. After he gets Superboy to ditch his buddies, Mxyzptlk is all like, hey man, I come from this parallel universe called the 5th dimension, and everyone who lives in that dimension can use magic, and you know, magic gets kind of boring. We watch Earth, you know, kind of like the same way you guys watch reality TV, and we're really fascinated about you, because if we can learn to become as super powered as you are, man, like our lives will be like so much better. Well, more entertaining, I guess, anyway. So he's like, what do you say, Superboy? You want to come back to the 5th dimension with me? Superboy is all like, nope, pretty good where I am. So Mxyzptlk is like, okay, you know what? I'll give you a challenge. If I win, you come with me to the 5th dimension, and if I lose, I guess I'll go home empty-handed. The challenge is Mxyzptlk says if he can make Lana Lang fall in love with him within 24 hours, well then, that's the challenge. Then he would win. Soup kind of quasi-agrees to this, but you know, doesn't really have a say in it. He has to go along. Much later. So on his quest, Mxyzptlk realizes that Lana really kind of cares for Clark, you know, being close friends and all. So he decides to impersonate Clark so he can get closer to Lana, and well, it seems like it's working. She's starting to fall for him, this doppelganger Clark. You know, Superboy even shows up at one point. He's like, yo, that ain't the Clark Kent that you know. Just a heads up there. And she's all like, woohoo, tell me about it. He's been different all day. And then she goes off with Clark, ditching Superboy. And at no point does Superboy tell her, hey, by the way, that's Mxyzptlk. He's pretty dangerous and he's impersonating Clark, so you know, like a heads up? Nope. Because, you know, if she's in danger, why would you tell her? Why would you explain the situation? You know, all is just peachy keen. Meanwhile, Professor Royer gets TJ's photos of the totem pole from earlier in the day, and he starts to study them, and he gets some ideas about, you know, our out-of-dimension friend there. He realizes that the totem pole was actually made to be a plug to close the door from the 5th dimension to ours. Like, that hole was the interdimensional wormhole, I guess. And with all the markings on the totem pole and stuff, he realizes there's kind of a way to get rid of Mxyzptlk. Oh, that name is so hard to say. And it has something to do with his name and reflection, but you know, he's not really sure about how those two things kind of correlate. But Superboy kind of puts it all together, and he's like, you know what? If I get Mxyzptlk to say his name backwards, that will end his time in our dimension, and he'll go back to the 5th dimension, and we'll all be spared from him. But that's kind of quite the conclusion. Like, how did he get to that? Like, how did he figure out that Mxyzptlk would have to say his own name backwards? Kind of seems like a bit of a logic leap from what we were given, but yeah, you know, sure, it's all cool. But trouble abounds. Mxyzptlk actually falls for Lana, and he uses his magic to put her under his spell so she will willingly go to the 5th dimension with him. He's like, yeah, you know what, Superboy? I don't care about you anymore. I'm all about Lana now. And Superboy is all super concerned. But he has a plan. So back at the old dimension hole, Superboy and TJ write this goodbye letter for Lana to read out loud, you know, for her friends and family, of why she's no longer in this universe. you know? But Mxyzptlk reads it out, you know, for her, and the letter does have his name spelt backwards, so when he reads that, you know, bloop, he disappears. Gone, right? Back in the 5th dimension. That, of course, breaks the spell that he had over Lana. I'm presuming that they're gonna plug up that dimension hole that they're at right now, and then everything goes back to normal. So with that, that is the end of this fantastic magic tale.
Yeah, so like I say, that was pretty interesting, right? It's kind of weird, man. Like, this episode seemed kind of off. There was something not quite kind of right about it. I can't really put my finger on it though. Like, you'd think with Mr. Mxy kind of in the whole mix of it that the episode would be a whole lot more whimsical, a whole lot more bouncy, a whole lot more just kind of yowza kind of in a way. And for some parts it kind of did, but for other parts it seemed like it was, I don't even really know. Like, I would almost want to say that they were kind of rushed, you know, to kind of film this episode. Like with the rooftop scenes with Mr. Mxyzptlk and Superboy, it's like Mr. Mxyzptlk was always kind of looking off screen and kind of, as he was talking to Superboy, and I would almost want to say he was just reading cue cards at that point. I guess you could also take it as he was just disinterested in Superboy at the time and didn't even really bother looking at him as he's talking to him. Kind of a power move. I don't know, something just seemed really off about it, and it kind of threw me out a bunch of times as I was watching it. But other than that, you know, I was really pumped up and excited to actually see a superpowered villain in the episode, and in the series, really. Because if we're talking about superhero shows from like the 70s and 80s, you really didn't see any superpowered villains from the comic books in the series. Of course, the Batman series from the 60s was the exception to the rule because there was so many villains in that show, even the really obscure ones. But beyond that series, if we're talking like, say, the Incredible Hulk, the live-action Spider-Man, the Wonder Woman series, they weren't fighting supervillains in those, they were just fighting some random crooks or industrialists or governments, you know, something like that. And with all those, I think there was just a few exceptions, maybe 1 or 2 episodes or made-for-TV movies. So for this Superboy series to kind of buck that trend and kind of really go towards, you know, the comic book inspirations was great. So this episode, even though I kind of felt it was off a little bit, it was still fun and charming to watch, and, you know, like I say, really awesome to see a super villain, magic villain, however you want to put it. And that started the trend for the series starting in season 2, so pretty awesome. And yeah. So let's go see what else we can dig up about Mr. Mxyzptlk and all that other kind of stuff and whatnot over here.
Okay, so let's get to the very beginning of our favorite little magical character here. Mr. Mxyzptlk would make his worldwide debut in Superman number 30 from 1944. And in that one, originally, man, he looked quite different than he does in this episode. Right, like with his purple suit, his bald head, his overly cartoonish look. Yeah, and like that look really works with that character, you know, if I'm being honest. But that was the golden age of comics version of him. That was from Earth 2, which, if you didn't know, long story, but basically the multiverse with the original DC stories for a while. But in the silver age of comics, Mr. Mxyzptlk was reintroduced in Action Comics number 208 from 1955, which would be Earth 1. And with that reintroduction, we did see a newly revamped character with his futuristic kind of look and clothes, and he has some hair, and that was the version of him that we all know and love, and that was the version that was copied for this featured episode. But you know, from those comics, like, it's all hip and all, like, of Mr. Mxyzptlk dealing with Superman, but we did see him start to deal with Superboy, and that was starting in Superboy number 78 from 1960. So of course those comics were kind of talking about the past with Clark Kent as a teenager, and with that we dealt with Mxyzptlk as a teenager as well, right? So he was kind of wreaking havoc with Superboy in Smallville before he was sent back home to the 5th dimension by his angry parents. Interdimensional grounding. Man, that's a new one. And that was Mr. Mxyzptlk's basically origin of how he started feuding with the last son of Krypton. So that's all hip and happening. So if we change medias to television, we did see Mr. Mxy making his cartoon debut in The New Adventures of Superman in 1966, and he did pop up in Super Friends and other cartoons of that era, but this featured episode was his first live action action appearance, so it was actually really cool to see that. And in this episode, he was portrayed by Michael J. Pollard. You know him, he played John in the original Star Trek series episode Miri. Yeah? Oh, and he was Bugs Bailey in Dick Tracy. Like, oh man, that was such an awesome movie. Oops, I'm sidetracked again. So after having to wait so long, to finally see Mr. Mxyzptlk in live action, the floodgates seemingly kind of opened, right after, because he did get a bunch more live action appearances in other shows. And some of these live action appearances were more of a departure from the character, either from his looks or from his powers or whatnot, but it was still based on the original Mxyzptlk. Like, say, for example, his next live appearance was in Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, where he was portrayed by Howie Mandel. He had all the magic and all that stuff, but he looked quite a bit different. Man, when you're in the 90s, man, you dress like you're in the 90s, because that fashion is like none other, man. In the show Smallville, he was portrayed by Trent Ford, and his character was known as Mikhail Mxyzptlk. So not really someone from the fifth dimension, but somebody who kind of had some mind control aspects to him and tried to use that to his advantage. Not quite the same character, but kind of a homage, I guess, technically. And most recently, Mr. Mixie did show up in Supergirl, where he was portrayed by Peter Galliot, and he played more of a deadly, kind of threatening kind of version of Mr. Mxyzptlk, where he was trying to woo Supergirl and would be willing to destroy the planet, if she didn't go along with him. That's not how it works, Mixie. Nope. But speaking of live appearances, Mr. Mxyzptlk was actually in the original script treatment for Superman 3. That's right, the classic Christopher Reeves movies. So the original story was, kind of quite different, but kind of similar. So the movie was going to be called Superman 3 Supergirl, which would introduce Superman's cousin into the feature film series, which would have been really cool. And the two main villains of the movie were going to be Brainiac and Mr. Mxyzptlk, right? But that was a really early kind of concept for the movie, and that story was scrapped, but you can kind of see how the whole story kind of snuck through to the final film. Like, let's say, for example, Brainiac, he is kind of a cybernetic android humanoid, and he was replaced basically by that intelligent supercomputer, especially when it kind of gained its own consciousness at the end of the movie. So that kind of checks out. Our good buddy Mr. Mxyzptlk is, fairly goofy and funny and quite resourceful, and he was basically replaced by Richard Pryor's character Gus, who can fit that same description. And Supergirl did not show up in this movie, but she was in her own movie 2 years later, so the concepts of that movie were still technically fleshed out, but just different. But yeah, so that's what I got for this stuff. It's kind of a cool character. He's not one of the main super villains like a Lex Luthor or anything like that, but it's still pretty dangerous because not much Superman can do against magic, right? But it's pretty cool to see him. He does make another appearance in Superboy season 2, so maybe I'll do another video on the guy, but we'll see how it goes. Yeah, so right on. So other than that, I guess that's that. Right on, and there you go. So thanks for watching the video. I hope you liked it as much as I did making it. Also, feel free to check out the source material that I featured in this video. And if you want to leave a comment on anything you may have liked or things I might have missed in this, feel free to do so. Or anything else, just to say hi. That's cool too. And other than that, have a great day. Thanks.